While they've never been the most technical fighting games, I've always had a soft spot for the Ultimate Ninja Storm series, and with the exception of Ultimate Ninja Storm 2, which had some very annoying online trophies, I've platinumed all of these games. Naruto is one of my favourite anime, and seeing as the last Naruto game, Naruto to Boruto Shinobi Strikers, did absolutely nothing for me, and 8 years have passed since Ultimate Ninja Storm 4, I've been craving a new Naruto game for a while now. But when Naruto X Boruto Ultimate Ninja Storm Connections was unveiled, I didn't quite know what to make of it. It's a game that rehashes the stories of the 4 mainline Ultimate Ninja Storm games, recutting and mashing them all together into one game, while also adding a second Boruto-focused story mode and a handful of new characters. From the start, Connections seemed like a strange proposition, and unfortunately, it turns out I was right to be skeptical of Ultimate Ninja Storm Connections. Connections should have been the ultimate celebration of the Naruto universe and the definitive Ultimate Ninja Storm game, but instead, it's a messy mishmash of a package that will only offer any value to the most hardcore of Naruto fans. While Connections features the series' best fighting mechanics yet, a colossal roster of over 130 playable characters, and an obscene amount of unlockables for longtime Naruto fans to nerd out over, it's dragged down by its history mode that butchers the story modes of the prior Ultimate Ninja Storm games, then sloppily reassembles the parts to create a Frankenstein's monster of a Naruto retelling, an underwhelming original storyline, and the unshakeable thought that this entire franchise is built atop the bones of a 15-year-old game. Let's start with the greatest strength of Connections, which is that its fighting mechanics themselves are pretty good. If you've played any of the prior Ultimate Ninja Storm games, or just about any 3D arena fighter for that matter, you know full well what to expect out of Connections. Like its predecessors, Connections is a relatively simple fighting game that's easy to pick up, even for people who aren't entrenched in the fighting genre. The most noticeable improvement this time around is that at a silky 60 FPS, Connections is the smoothest and fastest feeling Naruto game yet. While Connections makes some minor tweaks to the Ultimate Ninja Storm formula, for the most part, it plays almost identically to prior Ultimate Ninja Storm games. You're still dashing around stages, punching and throwing your opponents, using the substitution jutsu to teleport yourself out of the way of incoming attacks, and utilising a plethora of special jutsu, with each combatant in Connections' massive roster having 2 unique special jutsu and an ultimate attack referred to in-game as their secret technique, which is a gorgeously animated recreation of the character's most iconic attack from the anime. Though I have no idea why they're called secret techniques. It's always their most famous attack, and the prompt to perform a secret technique is just triangle triangle circle for every character, just like it is in every other Ultimate Ninja Storm game, so not much of a secret. One of my favourite touches in Connections is that there are a handful of special linked secret techniques where characters will perform a unique team-up attack if your team is composed of certain combinations of characters, like Naruto, Sasuke and Sakura, or Orochimaru, Tsunade and Jiraiya. Of course, performing any jutsu requires chakra, so you're always looking for windows to charge up your chakra bar between your opponent's attacks, which is where much of the strategy of fights comes in. Like prior Ultimate Ninja Storm games, many of the characters in Connections' roster have awakening abilities, whereby fully charging up their chakra bar in the heat of battle, they'll transform into a new, more powerful form with a modified moveset, like Sasuke's Curse Mark form, Naruto's various Ninetales transformations, or Lee and Guy's 8 Gates forms. Stringing together combos in an Ultimate Ninja Storm game is very simple. Even repeatedly mashing circle will perform a moderately powerful combo, but you can make things a bit more interesting by keeping opponents in the air with mid-air combos. And once you get the hang of cancelling a combo with a dash, then immediately linking it into another combo, you can string together near endless combos that can shred through an opponent's entire health bar within a matter of seconds. In connections, you'll pick your fighter as well as 2 support characters who you can call in to cover you in battle, which comes in handy when you want to get some breathing room from your opponent to charge up your chakra. You can also tag them into the fight and play as them if your opponent selects a character that you think one of your support characters would be better suited against. You can even tag one of your support characters in mid-combo, which keeps the momentum of fights moving along at a good clip. One significant change to the battle system in Connections is that battle items like paper bombs and caltrops are no longer a finite resource like they were in prior Ultimate Ninja Storm games. Instead, they're on a cooldown, allowing them to play a larger role in your strategy, as you can use them much more liberally in Connections than you could in prior Ultimate Ninja Storm games. Unfortunately, while Connections is technically the best an Ultimate Ninja Storm game has ever felt to play, the series' gameplay hasn't drastically evolved over the past 15 years, which is something I was acutely aware of the entire time I was playing Connections. This is even more apparent because, like prior UNS games, Connections recycles a ton of assets from prior games for its characters and environments, with many characters maintaining identical animations and movesets since the PS3 games, which is somewhat understandable when you're dealing with a roster this large, and I would rather they keep these characters around than ditch them. But many of these characters, at the very least the most popular ones, should have been given some touch-ups. Another issue that arises from having such a hefty roster is that, as you might expect, many characters fall into general archetypes and ultimately feel almost identical to control. So if you know how to play one Puppet Master, you'll be able to play all the other Puppet Masters in Connections just as competently. Because of all this, the only people I could ever recommend Connections to are the most hardcore Naruto fans and people who haven't had much experience with the series up to this point. Because if you've already played several of these games, it's hard not to find Connections gameplay at least a little monotonous. The weakest component of Connections is its shabbily thrown together history mode. History mode is essentially a condensed recut of the 4 mainline Ultimate Ninja Storm games, and it was the aspect of Connections that I was the most curious about, despite having played all the Ultimate Ninja Storm games before. The prior game's story modes were always a great way to relive the story of Naruto without rereading the entire manga, so I was hoping this would still be true in Connections. Sadly, this is not the case. Across its 8 chapters, History Mode takes us through a highlight reel of Naruto's biggest fights, but it's a very truncated retelling of the story that glazes over several major plot beats and fights, with the majority of the story coming in the form of still images from the anime, with VO over them to fill in the blanks between the battles. Connections trims out far too many of the most important and iconic moments of Naruto. It only shows a fraction of the Chunin exams. You essentially just play Naruto's fights with Kiba and Neji, completely shafting the entire supporting cast and removing some incredibly memorable fights, like Lee and Sasuke's battles with Gaara. It also skips over the 3 Sannin fight, and the second half of Naruto and Sasuke's original fight at the final valley. For that matter, the majority of the fights in the Sasuke retrieval arc are cut. The only one shown is the Kimimaro fight, and even then, it's only Naruto's portion of the fight, which is the least memorable part. It's Lee and Gaara's fights with Kimimaro that are the real meat of the battle, and the moments that still stand out in my memory. The missing fights become even more glaring once you get into the Shippuden content. There's no Gaara vs Deidara, no Asuma vs Hidan, and we don't even get Sakura's fight with Sasori, which is arguably her best moment in the entire series. The most frustrating thing is that it feels like there's no real rhyme or reason for which fights CyberConnect chooses to show and which ones they skip. Most of the fights that you get to play feature either Naruto or Sasuke, and if the history mode exclusively showed the events of the series from their perspectives, that would be fine, and it would make sense why CyberConnect chose to glaze over so many major moments. But then there are occasionally fights with other characters randomly sprinkled in, like the third Hokage's showdown with Orochimaru, and the Jiraiya vs Pain fight, which makes the absence of so many other major battles stand out all the more. Ultimate Ninja Storm Connections does still include some of the best fights from the prior games, and it was nice to revisit them. In doing so, I was also reminded that the Ultimate Ninja Storm games still have some of the best cinematic QuickTime events in the business, but it hasn't changed these fights in any meaningful ways, so there's no reason to play Connections over the original games that these battles are pulled from, which will give you a far more comprehensive retelling of the Naruto story. I do have one other gripe with History Mode, and this is a very minor nitpick, but it's something I found distracting. Connections uses stills from the anime during its History Mode, but for some reason, anytime there's blood in a screenshot, they paint it all black. I'm guessing this was done to secure a lower rating for the game in certain regions, but it looks very strange, and I couldn't help but notice it every time. History Mode is at least bookended by a couple of nice original cutscenes, but they don't make up for History Mode's numerous shortcomings. This certainly isn't the definitive way to experience the Ultimate Ninja Storm story like I had hoped it would be. The other big piece of story content in Ultimate Ninja Storm Connections is the brand new Special Story Mode, which features an original Boruto-centric story. I'll be honest with you, it's always a bit of an uphill battle to get me invested in a Boruto story. I am caught up on the Boruto manga because I love this universe and like to stay up to date with what's happening in it, but the series is so hit or miss for me. It has incredibly high highs, and I genuinely do like some of the new characters like Kawaki and Sarada, but it's also really fucked up some aspects of the universe in my opinion. I hate the idea of the scientific ninja tools that can store different jutsu, as they devalue having specific bloodline traits and the abilities that we watched characters train relentlessly to learn when these techniques can just be stored in a capsule and performed by anybody. Everybody in this universe also feels so obscenely overpowered at this point, and I am so sick of the Otsutsuki. I wasn't in love with the idea of them in Naruto, and at this point, their storyline has been going on for so many years. I just wish we could move on to something new. It also speaks volumes that the moments that seem to truly resonate with people in Boruto are the ones focused on Naruto and Sasuke. This just goes to show that the cast of Boruto isn't anywhere near as strong as the cast of Naruto. It feels like the majority of the audience still isn't truly invested in Boruto and his friends, even after all these years. Hell, even Bandai Namco seem acutely aware of this. This game is called Naruto Cross Boruto, but Boruto isn't anywhere to be seen on the box art. It's just 5 versions of Naruto, so they clearly know what most people are here for. But despite all this, I still went into Connections Special Story Mode with an open mind, hoping for the best. And at first, I was pleasantly surprised. From the jump, you can tell that this mode is far more high effort than the History Mode, winning brownie points with me immediately, thanks to Special Story Mode opening with a gorgeously animated new fight between Naruto and Sasuke. Even more so as we play as Sasuke in this fight, which I wasn't expecting, seeing as these games tend to show Naruto and Sasuke's fights from Naruto's perspective. However, there is a reason for this choice that you'll understand once you get a little ways into the story. Unfortunately, this fantastic opening is pretty much where this story mode peaks. Unlike the story modes of prior Ultimate Ninja Storm games, there's no free roam of the Hidden Leaf Village, or anywhere else for that matter. In Connections, it's just fights and cinematics, the vast majority of which are just lightly animated cutscenes using the in-engine character models, so they do look quite rough. Once in a blue moon, we get a very well animated cinematic, but they're few and far between, so don't expect the level of production value found in the story modes of Ultimate Ninja Storm 3 and 4. Special Story Mode centres around Boruto and his friends playing a mysterious VR game called Ninja Heroes that seemingly appeared out of thin air, with nobody being able to figure out who developed it. I did find it a little strange that they opted to call the game within the game Ninja Heroes, seeing as Ultimate Ninja Heroes is already the name of a trilogy of Naruto games for the PSP. Still, I digress, as I'm sure the majority of people weren't as obsessed with the PSP as I was, and probably aren't even aware of those games. Unfortunately, Special Story Mode feels like it's just retreading familiar ground by rehashing plot ideas and themes from Shippuden, like the infinite Tsukuyomi, and the villain Mers being pitched as Pain's successor. We've not only seen these ideas done before, but we've seen them done far better than they are in Connections, so it's hard not to feel like Special Story Mode is just spinning its wheels throughout. Naruto is such a sincere, heartfelt franchise, which makes the soullessness of this story mode sting all the more. Much of Special Story Mode takes place within the digital landscape of this VR game, and the one interesting aspect this brings is that players get to choose an avatar to play as in the game, meaning you can tackle the fights in the virtual world as any character in the roster, so you're not just stuck playing as Boruto throughout the entire story mode. This also allows the developers to get a bit more creative and pair up characters that wouldn't normally make sense to be fighting side by side. Every fight in Special Story Mode has optional challenges tied to it, but they're frustratingly uncreative. Nearly every battle's challenges are some combination of clearing the battle with 60% health remaining, landing 3 ninjutsu techniques, and finishing off your opponent with a secret technique. If you're going to include these kinds of challenges, at least try and be a little more imaginative with the parameters to mix things up. In both Special Story Mode and History Mode, you'll be graded for your performance after each fight, and you'll need to S-rank each fight in both modes if you want the Platinum or all the achievements. But don't think this is going to add much replayability, because it is exceptionally easy to get an S rank. There were only a couple of fights where I didn't get an S rank naturally on my first time playing them, and even then I easily secured it on a second attempt. If there's one thing you do have to give Connections credit for, it's that the game offers an abundance of content. Outside of its 2 single-player story modes, Connections also offers plenty of other returning modes from prior Ultimate Ninja Storm games, like the Survival mode, where you fight a gauntlet of enemies back-to-back on a single health bar in challenges of varying difficulties. There are a series of tournaments against the AI to conquer, and you get to duke it out in a massive assortment of lovingly recreated environments from throughout Naruto's world. Connections also offers an enormous amount of unlockables for Naruto fans to geek out over. There are hundreds and hundreds of costumes and accessories to customize the characters with, and a gargantuan encyclopedia spanning hundreds of pages of character profiles and lore from across the entire Naruto universe. Of course, Connections also offers an online versus mode, complete with the full suite of features you'd expect. However, it is worth noting that my online experience was wildly inconsistent. I played with my PS5 wired in with an Ethernet cable, and my experience with other fighting games is usually flawless. But with Connections, the experience was completely unpredictable from match to match. Sometimes I'd get matches that were silky smooth, other times there would be so much lag that the fights were borderline unplayable. I've always loved the cel-shaded art style of the Ultimate Ninja Storm games, and while some of the character models still look decent here, it's hard to deny that Connections is looking a little dated. All these characters, animations, and environments are built atop the skeleton of a PS3 game after all. Hopefully this will be the end of Bandai Namco milking the Ultimate Ninja Storm series, so they can finally do something new with the Naruto IP. Give me a Naruto RPG for God's sake. Hell, I'll happily take the Naruto equivalent of Dragon Ball Z Kakarot. The Ultimate Ninja Storm games have never been the most intricate fighting games, but as a fan of Naruto, I've always had a good time with them. And to a degree, I still did at times while playing Connections. But while I try not to dwell in negativity on this channel, as I'd rather celebrate the good sides of the games industry, I think it's also important to call out when a company puts out an underwhelming product. And it's hard not to feel a bit cynical about the existence of Ultimate Ninja Storm Connections, which in some ways feels like a cheaply made asset flip. While Connections plays better than any prior Ultimate Ninja Storm game, and offers an obscene amount of characters and arenas, both its story modes are massive disappointments, which hurts all the more when you remember how good the story modes of the UNS games have been in the past. It's also impossible to ignore the fact that this PS5 game is built upon the foundation of a PS3 game from 16 years ago. If you're a hardcore Naruto fan, there is fun to be found in Connections, but even then, I couldn't recommend buying it, as you're still far better off with the Ultimate Ninja Storm Collection or Ultimate Ninja Storm 4, which have far better story modes and can be snapped up dirt cheap at this point. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, or leave a comment. You can find countless other videos on my channel, including my recent video where I ran through my most anticipated games of 2024. And be sure to stay tuned for my upcoming reviews of Tekken 8, Suicide Squad Killed the Justice League, and Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown.